Hello, and this week in the Wine School we are looking at the Loire Valley, which tributaries start in the Massif Central in the middle of France and flow down to the sea across roughly a third of France. This naturally enough covers a huge range of soils, aspects, different altitudes, so there's a huge range of wines made here. Given it's in the cooler northern third of France, it's naturally enough more of a white wine area. It's also one of the most beautiful wine regions, with loads of chateaux dotted around this bucolic countryside. Really lovely area to visit. The main grape varieties here are Shannon Blanc, Chevrony Blanc and Melander Burgoyne, often just called Muscadet after the region it's grown in, for whites, and for reds Pinot Noir, Gamay, but more importantly Cabernet Franc, and a smashing of other grape varieties that are permitted as well, but those are the main ones that we'll be looking at today. The four main areas we can divide the Loire into are the Pays Nantais, closer to the sea, Anjou-Saumur, Touraine and Loire Valley, and Central Loire. From the coast to the last important wine district at Pouilly is about 300 miles, so it's quite a big area we're covering. So starting off today in Pouilly, Pouilly-sur-Loire makes Pouilly Fumé, or Blanc Fumé de Pouilly, and neighbouring Sancerre, just over the river, makes wines of a similar style, similar soils. Mostly limestone. There's a high proportion of silex, which is a type of sort of clay flint, and this gives the wine that distinctively flinty aroma that you find in the Sauvignons from this area. I would describe it as the rather pleasing word petrichor, which describes the smell of rain on sun-baked soil and stone. It gives it that, if you think of that lovely flinty, earthy aroma you get on a summer's day when it starts raining, that's very reminiscent of the wines from this area. Sancerre is roughly twice the size of Pouilly Fumé, and since the 1970s it's actually tripled in size to gain the ascendancy over Pouilly Fumé. And although at the top end they're seen as on a par in terms of quality, I would argue at the bottom end some Sancerre can be a little bit ropey, so again it's worth looking for a good producer. In Sancerre there's about 14 villages around the hilltop town of Sancerre that are permitted to use the AOC appellation, and there's some vineyards that make some particularly good wines. There's Henri Bourgeois' Le MD, which is the Mont Damné, the Damned Mountain, which is a precipitatively steep slope, which just catches the sun and gives a particularly deep, long-lived Sancerre, can age for sort of 10 to 15 years. Also in Sancerre, they're allowed to use Pinot Noir for reds and rosés, which are particularly good quality. The rosés are very nice, and the Pinot Noir, particularly in a warm year, can be very, very reminiscent of Burgundy, which after all is only just slightly further south and east from there. The example we have here from Sancerre is the Domaine du Puy-Saumur, Sancerre. So we'll try this one first. This has that lovely sort of green apple, very herbaceous, leafy character. Lots of acidity in there. Again, that green apple coming through, that lovely lime blossom character, and that minerality, that slightly flinty gunpowder aroma, particularly on the finish at the back of the palate. A classic match for this is goat's cheese. Sancerre, as well as being an appellation for wine, is also an appellation for goat's cheese. The one that's made here is an absolute perfect match for this. Also goes really well with seafood, lighter chicken dishes, that kind of thing. Anything else you'd expect Sauvignon to work with, but goat's cheese is absolutely perfect with this wine. Away from the river, and Sancerre and Pouilly-sur-Loire, we have the other central vineyards of Cancy, Roilly and Monetou-Salon. And these make wines, again, in a broadly similar style, but they don't quite match Sancerre and Pouilly Fumé at the top end of the quality scale. But I would argue, particularly with Sancerre, a better Cancy, Roilly or Monetou-Salon can actually be better than a cheap Sancerre. Although it's right next to Sancerre, Monetou-Salon is on much lighter soils, so it never really gets the same minerality. It can be good. Cancy, again, is generally quite a simple wine. At the top end can be better quality as well from a good, conscientious producer. For me, the best one is Roilly, because it has some of the classic clay and marl subsoils that get that real lovely drainage, and some of the better vineyards that have a nicer aspect facing slightly further south, you get that very Sancerre-like minerality, which I think is just takes it a cut above the other two in terms of quality. Heading further down the Loire, we go through a much larger area around the town of Gien, the Côte du Génois, and again this is Sauvignon Blanc territory. It makes decent, very Loire typical Sauvignon Blanc. It's rarely inspiring, but again it's a good everyday wine. The next main town we come to is Orléans, and the vineyards immediately to the south include the Côte de Loire, which makes some lovely rosé and red wine, and Jasnier, which is less well known but makes some really good dry Shannon Blancs. Very rare to find them over here, but they're really good wines. Further to the southwest, there's Chevrony and Korchevani. Chevrony is an appellation which is mainly Sauvignon Blanc, but they're also allowed to blend in some Chardonnay here as well. And for me, not being a huge Sauvignon fan, I actually find the wines here, it just cuts the angles off Sauvignon Blanc. I find it a little bit softer and more approachable. And Korchevani is an appellation for an unusual grape, the Romarantin. This, a bit like Melander Burgoyne, is thought to be related to Chardonnay in some way, and the wines from this area are particularly reminiscent of Chablis. So if you like your Chablis, this is one that's worth seeking out. As we head into Touraine, around the town of Tours, Vouvray and to a lesser extent Montlouis-sur-Loire are really well known for Chenin Blanc in every style from bone dry to lusciously sweet. Much of the soil here is based on tuffeau, which is a particularly well-draining limestone, and a lot of the vineyards have caves channeled out underneath them where they store the wine, very similar to those in Champagne in the chalk caves there. And this one, a lot of these soils overlaying that are silex. Again, you've got that sort of flinty marl soil on the top, which helps with drainage and tends to give the wines that little bit more minerality than wines from in other parts that don't have those topsoils. The one we have here is a Cuvée Silex from Vigneux Chevrony, and this is labelled sec, which is dry, although they can make wines, as I said, all the way across the spectrum. And what I often find with these wines is, although they're labelled dry, they do give the impression of sweetness, which is the same thing you can get from some Rieslings. They've got that lovely honeyed character. On the nose, you've got that gorgeous acacia honey and floral aroma, and on the palate, you've got that luscious impression of sweetness, but really taut acidity behind it that holds it all together. It's got a lovely lingering finish. I think this is a really good wine for lots of different things, so pork, chicken dishes, but for me it works really well with Chinese food, particularly duck and vegetable dishes. It's got that lovely acidity that cuts through most things, but also the honeyed element means it ties in flavours from different ends of the spectrum, either the aromatic ginger or the saltiness of soy. I think it just holds it all together and really brings out the best of the wine and the food, rather than simply being a wine to drink with food. It actually complements it. The other side of Tours, we have the predominantly red wine regions of Chinon, Bourgogne and Saint-Nicolas de Bourgogne. Cabernet Franc has really found its home here. In Bordeaux, it's rarely more than a seasoning grape, but here it's got that lovely raspberry and blackcurrant leaf freshness, lovely juicy, crunchy fruit that gives it that immediate appeal, but the best examples can actually age for many years as well. Cabernet Sauvignon really wouldn't ripen properly here. Cabernet Franc actually ripens quite early, or it certainly gets that what's called phenolic ripeness, where you get the fruit character coming through very early on. And if it ripens further, it has the advantage that it doesn't lose too much of its acidity, so you get that lovely balance. So in lighter years, you get a lovely light fresh wine, and if you get a bit more sunshine and a longer ripening period, the wine develops that full ripeness, which means it can age a little bit more. It's got a bit more depth of flavour. Now, Bourgogne in particular, and Saint-Nicolas de Bourgogne, they're slightly sheltered. There's quite an elevated plateau that's forested, and that gives it a little microclimate, which means it's just that little bit warmer than Chinon. So for me, Chinon, generally speaking, is a little bit lighter in style. Bourgogne and Saint-Nicolas de Bourgogne, generally a little bit deeper and firmer. Anjou-Saumur, which is based around the towns of Angers and Saumur, it's very much a white wine area, and particularly off-dry sweet wines. There's a trend towards more dryness these days as palates change and people prefer generally a drier style of wine. And Chenin Blanc again is the key wine here. As we get nearer the sea, the climate's again that little bit cooler than it is in the central vineyards and Touraine, but we're getting the benefit. The vineyards tend to be much closer to the river, so you benefit from 1 or 2 degrees of warmth radiated up from the river as it travels through. If a little bit further away from the river, if there are any vines, it tends to make quite an inspiring wine. The rosé from this area can, with a few exceptions, be avoided. The Cabernet d'Anjou can be quite good. Rosé d'Anjou, which is often made from the unfortunately named Grolot grape, can be a bit thin and sickly. I've had a few decent examples, but best avoided. There's better rosés from elsewhere. What really grows well here is, if you go into the tributaries of the Loire, the Léon and Aboise, they make exceptional sweet wine in these areas. The Côte de l'Aboise is gaining its stature. There's a few really interesting winemakers starting to really grow and develop this area. but it's the Côte de Léon that makes some of the best sweet wines in the area and indeed the world. And in the Côte de Léon, they had some of the steeper south-facing slopes that really helps capture that sunlight. And sub-regions within the Côte de Léon, one of the most famous is the Crêt de Chaume, which is the first and so far only Grand Cru in the whole of the Loire, and neighbouring Bonnezeau, which was recently elevated to AOC status in its own right, which again makes some really lovely wines, a cut above basic Côte de Léon. But all of the wines from this region are worth seeking out. It's actually one of the few wines I found from my own birth here was a Côte de Léon, which at 40 years old at the time was still drinking perfectly well, and I think I only paid £10 a bottle for it, so they can be exceptionally good value wines. On the other side of the Loire, to the north, there's the steep slopes of Chevrony vineyards. Same aspect to the sun, that sort of southwest aspect as some of the Côte de Léon, but here the wines are dry, almost austerely dry. Shannon Blanc again, but in a very different style from those to the south of the river. They need at least a few years to even come round and be approachable, to round out a little bit to balance their quite fierce acidity. There's two of the top vineyards within the area are Cul de Sarente and La Roche-Amoyne, names that are worth seeking out. Very tiny production, but really lovely wines, but they definitely need a lot of time to come around. Adjoining Anjou to the southeast is Saumur, around the town of the same name. Sparkling wines made across the whole of the Loire region as Crémant de Loire, and in this area it is usually labelled Saumur Mousseux, and quite often it's used to sort of mop up some of the less ripe vintages, because in sparkling wine you actually want a slightly underripe, austere, high acid grape to produce good sparkling white wine, but actually Crémant de Loire, which is produced across the whole region and is some of the production in Anjou as well, is actually of higher quality. It has higher and more stringent regulations around its production, permitted yields and that kind of thing. But I would argue it is still, both of these, Saumur Mousseux and Crémant de Loire, they can be very keenly priced alternatives to champagne at usually half to even a third of the price of a decent champagne. The west of this area is Saumur-Champigny, and again here we find Cabernet Franc in that light, fresh, juicy style that we found in Chinon and St Nicholas de Bourgogne. Never quite as firm or as structured or necessarily as age-worthy, but I think these can be excellent value wines. And here we've got an example of Saumur-Champigny from Thierry Germain, organic and biodynamically produced, unfined and unfiltered, so there's a lot of depth of colour in here. Lovely, bright, light colour. It's only about 2 years old. There's that lovely sort of blackcurrant leafiness that I mentioned earlier coming out of the glass. It's leafy, but it's not green. There's lots of fruit in there, but it's very fresh as well. Again, you've got that lovely freshness, a little bit of tannin in there. Don't forget this is Cabernet still, but it's got a little bit of that pencil shaving character. That's typical of the grape, which is why you don't often find it on its own, particularly in much warmer areas. It can get a little bit too almost metallic, but here it's just got that lovely balance of that savoury element, the fruit and the acidity. This is a really good food wine. If you chilled this down, it'd be a perfect picnic wine. It's really great with charcuterie, pâté, pickles, that kind of thing. It'd also be a really good pairing with roast pork or game. Really lovely wine. The last main area we come to is the Pays Nantais, around the town of Nantes, around the mouth of the Loire. The main grape variety here is Melander Burgoyne, and as I mentioned earlier, it's thought to be related to Chardonnay, but here it's made in a very, very dry style. What I find quite interesting as you sort of go through the Loire is in the west, you have the very dry wines at the slightly higher altitudes inland, in Pouilly and Sancerre. As you move more towards the middle, where the Loire slows down and becomes quite mellow, you've got these slightly broader wines, a little bit of sweetness in them, some red wines, and as you move towards the sea and the Loire starts flowing a bit faster, and you get that maritime influence coming in, cooling it slightly, you again come to these very dry wines around Muscadet. Naturally enough, in this quick tour from east to west in the Loire, we've missed out some small areas, a few interesting wines, and some of the VDQS wines. Anyway, I hope this has given you a little insight into this area and whetted your appetite to explore it a little more. This is the fourth episode of France. We've looked at Bordeaux, Burgundy, Rhône, and now Loire. There's lots of other areas to explore in France. Interesting areas like Alsace, Languedoc-Roussillon, Jura, Savoie, and all the little sort of pockets all over France that produce some really interesting wines. But we're going to park France there for the moment, and in the next episode we're heading into Spain. So I look forward to seeing you then. Santé.